true.
What was like a year before, right?
Yeah, it was quite a process. There was many battles fought. It's true. So I guess you could say all that is sort of summed up by their victory on the 24th. Okay, we're back. We're looking at page Kuf Base and chapter Vav. And we're coming to the end here. Okay, so by Inyan Hu. The Mesiris Nefesh of Matisyahu Banav Haisa Zeh Shalachmu Neged HaYavanim. What was their Mesiris Nefesh? This they fought against the Greeks. Yesh Lomar the Zeh Shagam LaAchre Mesiris Nefesh. We could say that even after they had Mesiris Nefesh, Haba'a de Gilu HaYechida, which comes, right? Where does Mesiris Nefesh spring forth from? From feeling a revelation of your own Yechida. So after they had this Mesiris Nefesh through the revelation of the Yechida, Nirgash etzlam sheyeshnu menagid shetzrich lilchom negdo. They still felt, even after they sort of released the Yechida, they still felt there was an opponent that they needed to fight against, right? And why is that? And we were speaking about this a little bit at the end of the class yesterday with Yoram over here, that, in other words, if the level of the Havaya de la Eila came out, so what is this notion of it being encloaked in nature nonetheless? If it's Havaya de la Eila, it's now we're saying in other languages, the Yechida, right? So what's this notion of the Yechida being cloaked, right, in the Kochas HaGiluim? So what are the Kochas HaGiluim, the revealed powers? They represent your 10 spheros of your mind and your heart, right? Whereas the Yechida is like above them. It represents the beyond the Seder Ishtalshlus of your soul, right? So he's saying is that the fact that their Yechida was triggered, but they still felt they needed to fight, right? That there was an opponent, because if you really go to the Yechida it means one. And at that level in the Yechida itself, there is no opponent because there's only God, right? There is no other thing. Ein zulaso, there's nothing but him, right? So the fact that they were in the Yechida, but they still felt that there was an opponent, it's because they were dealing with the Yechida as it was in conjunction with the revealed powers of the soul. So we spoke about this in previous memorim, right? There's a level of Kesser, which still in some way takes into account the Seder Ishtalshlus, right? The Kasher Gila Yechidu Kamoshu B'Makoma, when there's a revelation of the Yechida as it is in its true place, since the Yechida does not have opposing it, what we call Le'umadze, like an opponent. And what he means by that is, there's a verse that says, God made everything this opposed to this. So no matter where you're going to go, if there's going to be chesed of Abraham, there's going to be chesed of Yishmael, right? There's always going to be an opposing force because it's like the container that the Kedusha comes in.
That's why you could say like the Arabs are very hospitable and like they're known for like hospitality.
Right? It's chesed of Klippa.
Yeah.
And you have also in Gevurah, right? You have Yitzchak, so you have Esav, right? So he's like the man of the sword, right? And his blessing was a sword. It's like the idea of Gevurah, but it's Gevurah when it like leaks into the other side. And you have this all the way up, even in like high levels like Chokhmah, which normally you consider Chokhmah. If you take the letters of Chokhmah, it spells what?
Koma.
What's that?
Koma.
Koachma, right? Koachma means the power of what? Which means like you're just sort of nullified and totally bittul. Guess what? On the side of Klippa, there's a Klippa called Re'uma, which is one of the names of the concubines of Terach, I believe. And it says that Re'uma means look at my ma, right? And it was like, look how bittul I am. It's like your opposite of bittuls. At every level of the Seder Ishtalshlus, you have some kind of opposing force, except the Yechida, right? The Yechida, it says that there is no Klippa that opposes it, because you get up to like a certain point where you're beyond the duality. So if you would reveal the Yechida as it is in its place, since it doesn't have any opposing force, Hamasiris Nefesh, you could have a level of Masiris Nefesh where you don't even consider the fact that there's an opponent there, right? In other words, you're just like sort of in a state of bliss. It says regarding the Alter Rebbe, for example, when he was in the prison, right? He didn't want to leave because he didn't see himself to be sort of like forced into this negative situation. He was in this state of the Yechida, total Masiris Nefesh, and he was like in a divine bliss, in a unity with Hashem. It says that the story that his Rebbes came in, the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid came in to back from the dead, mind you, into his prison cell to like tell him to keep going, is because he was basically like, I'm good. They were like, no, you're in here so you can keep spreading Hasidus. You have to go out, right? Because he got to this point basically where he wasn't experiencing himself to be in an oppositional situation because he was holding by the Yechida, right? So if you really experience the Yechida in its place, then you don't consider the opponent at all. The fact that Matisyahu and his sons got to the Yechida, how do we know? Because they were ready to like mamash do the impossible. They reached the above the Seder Ishtalshlus of their souls, ready to take on an army. But the fact that they still felt they had to fight, and they perceived opponents, bichlal, because it wasn't the ultimate revelation of the Yechida. It was the Yechida, but it was the Yechida as it's positioned to recognize the powers that are below it.
Is it like, would you say like that Das was being revealed?
Because
Das is like the part of Keser that's like...
That's in the Kochos.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Das is not.
I wouldn't really necessarily go with Das on that one. If you wanted to give it like an address, it would be sort of like, remember we said that Atik really goes on the essence of God.
Yeah.
Actually, not on a sphera. It's just that it's Nimtza, Nelam, Umizgale.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this from the Reb Chaim Vital. That we actually, there's three heads.
Unknowable heads, yeah.
Right? One is unknowable, but there's three heads. It basically refers to Panemius Atik, and Arich.
Yeah.
And those are three levels of Keser.
Yes.
And they're all really called Atik in a sense because the Atzmus is called Atik, and the Atzmus is found in each one of them in a slightly different way.
Yes.
So the one that's really so the idea is that the Yechida is, we can just basically call that the Yechida as well, right? The Yechida is the same thing. Like the Yachid is mamash the Atzmus. The Yechida is when it sort of starts to come out and the Atzmus is becomes a sphera, but you could call that, let's say, Panemius Atik. It's completely identical with the Atzmus when it's so to speak what he's calling in its place. But then it has finds itself even while it's still in the Keser in lower positions.
Okay.
And so when it comes, let's say, for example, into a place called Arich, it's the Keser. It's still like the Atzmus, but it's found now in a situation where it's called the head of the Seder Ishtalshlus.
Yeah.
Just like Arich Anpin, that we say that they're called the long faces, because those are the spheros, but they're the spheros before they actually come into Kalim.
Yeah.
So the idea is that the Keser at that point is recognizing and taking into account that there is such a world as Kalim. It's not in the place of the Kalim, it's not restricted, it's not limited, because the light is still in a Keser form, which means you could still call it the Yechida at some level.
Yeah.
But it's the Yechida as it is in position and sort of taking into account the 10 spheros and what we're calling the Kochas Agiloim. So the way I spoke about it to Yoram yesterday, Yoram was like, and again, I hate to say it because we're going to learn the whole sikh about it, but I'm taking it from there, is like when you could trigger a feeling of the Yechida, but it doesn't necessarily stay with you the whole day while you're busy with your activities. No. It could be that you triggered it in the morning and it's having an impression on you later. Yes. Right? Or you could trigger it and it's like it doesn't go away and you take it with you and you're like living a Yechida Yid, right? Yeah. So it's the difference is whether the Yechida is just there but having an influence on other things, or whether it is like what he's calling here in its place, which means it shines in the brightness as though there is nothing else.
Is that like what we've talked about before when like Shlomo was in rule? He had a revelation that like it was there and there was no real opposition because things were subjugated to him, the world was subjugated. But as soon as he left, he departed, and that spirit departed, that energy departed. Right. It went back to just being like, oh, I'm opposing you again.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like truly nullified.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So there still is the existence of the opponent, even at that level of Yechida. And what's the proof is you take it away, it comes back.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, so they got to a certain level of Yechida, but it was a level which was still connected with the revealed powers. He says in footnote 32, he says, actually, believe it or not, there's a quality, like an advantage to Mesiras Nefesh in this way. In other words, over and above not experiencing any opponents. Because only when you have Mesiras Nefesh in a way where you actually do go to war, right, and fight, which is on one level showing a decrease in the level of the Yechida, because it's showing that it recognizes opposition. On the other hand, when you're actually going to take on the opposition from that perspective, you go into the place of the opposition and you root them out, so to speak, from their place, as opposed to just shining light on them from above and making it as though they don't exist. That doesn't have a panemius effect on the kochos hagiluim, on the opponent, right? So the idea of like that, you're dealing with a yechida which still recognize the kochos hagiluim. On one hand, we're saying that's lower because the yechida is not just bright light with nothing else in existence. On the other hand, it's higher because the fact that you're taking your yechida and you're putting it now in a place of the kochos hagiluim means you're going to uproot them from their own place, as opposed to sort of like shine this makif light on them, which might not actually affect them personally.
So is it suggesting that like the revelation of the Yechida in its highest form wouldn't necessarily nullify it at its core?
He is kind of saying that a little bit. Yeah, he's saying that it might bring the world to a state of total negation, but it's not even recognizing the existence of the enemy. So it's so you're not really taking care of the enemy. Yeah. You're just making him not be there in any way.
As opposed to a lower level Yechida gives you the ability to connect with Hashem in his essence form, but it lets you like interface with the world in a way that like you can outroot the source of the opposition.
Yeah, the difference would be like davening versus learning Chassidus. When you learn Chassidus, we said you're like first of all, davening versus Torah in general. Davening is like you're taking it up with your Nefesh Bahamas, right? You're like warring with him. When you're davening, it's the Alter Rebbe says in davening, if you think that you're having like negative extraneous thoughts, means you're having a bad davening, it means you don't understand yourself, right? If you're having extraneous thoughts, it means you're having a very good davening, and therefore your animal soul like is wrestling back because you're like arousing your godly soul. So the animal soul is arousing itself back because there's a fight going on, because you're in the place of the enemy when you're davening. You're trying to purify your thoughts and have clear thoughts. The more you do that, the more you're engaged in the war. So davening is also called warfare, right? Torah, on the other hand, is called Torah Shalom. You're dealing with the world only as it is in Torah. You're not actually putting yourself into the place of the world. But in Nigla of Torah, you're at least dealing with the world is an actual world. You're talking about worldly things. You're just talking about them in the dimension of Torah. When you learn Chassidus, you're learning about Torah, which is beyond the world, and you're elevating the world to the point that it doesn't even exist, because you're talking about angels and spheros, and you're basically like negating the existence of the world. So on one hand, that's the highest thing. You should just learn Chassidus the whole day, because you're taking care of the world without even like sort of letting it escape and be a thing, right? You're talking about it in its. On the other hand, what do we do after we learn Chassidus? We go and daven, right? Because the idea is that you want to take the battle into the place of the animal soul so that you can root it out from its own place, right? It's a similar idea here. Okay, so anyway, that was a footnote. Inside, but he's not saying that inside the actual memory. He's saying the opposite, right? Is that we're dealing only with the level of the Yechida as it is connected with the revealed powers. Therefore, the light which is above the Seder Ishtalshlus, which was unleashed and drawn out due to their Mesiras Nefesh. Remember, that's the whole point, that we trigger it with our Mesiras Nefesh. And what did they sort of trigger was the miracle of giving over the mighty into the weak and the many into the few. Therefore, that miracle was cloaked in nature. Because again, when they had the arousal from below to reach their Yechida, it wasn't the ultimate Yechida. It was the Yechida as itself took into account their own nature. They still realized they had an opponent. Therefore, what they triggered in Hashem was also a level of Hashem, which was the Yechida, but as it recognizes nature. Right, as it recognizes the revealed powers, the finite world, and therefore it came down as a miracle, which was the Yechida cloaked in nature. Make sense?
Yeah.
Ilan, you following that?
Yeah, I think so.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. The Yisera Mizo. What's more than this? Beteva de olam hazeh hatachton shaklipos govrim bo. Okay, so he was saying that it came down in nature, and more than that, in the nature of this world, which is the lowest world where the clippers are so overpowering. That the actual opponent is not just like friendly little 10 spheros, they're like the fierce notion of other, which is like this mighty and many Greeks that they needed to fight against. So in other words, the miracle came down, the Yechida, as it was cloaked in a nasty nature, right? Where it was like basically the mighty Greeks had to be defeated, a very serious opponent, which seems to oppose Hashem. Now let's revisit what the Frierdiker Rebbe said in his Maimer, that the winning of the war was a miracle which was associated with the lower unity. Remember, we said the lower unity was the war, finding the oil was the higher unity, and it lasting for 8 days was the higher name of Hashem. So now we want to say this, that we've accessed the Yechida, but as it is cloaked in its association with nature, which means that it showed up as a miracle which was cloaked in nature to a certain degree. That is connected with we said before, is called Yehuda Tata, the lower unity. Now how are we saying is the lower unity when really this miracle also came from above the Hishtalshalus entirely? And the answer is because that light which is above the Hishtalshalus, Nimshach b'nei zeh, which was drawn down in this miracle, it was cloaked. In other words, and that means once it was cloaked, it means it's giving room for an experience of self and separateness and the existence of the world, which is called Yehuda Tata. Right? What is Yehuda Tata? When you recognize yourself as a separate existence, but you want to like bind it to Hashem. You're not negating yourself. You're just bending your will to Hashem's will, even though you still have your own will. So therefore, you can see why this process was called a Yehuda Tata, because even though it came from a very high source, since it recognizes the existence of nature, which is basically some oppositional real thing, which is being bent over to the will of Hashem, it's like a experience of Yehuda Tata. It's not Yehuda Tata. Yehuda Tata does not involve miracles usually, right? Yehuda Tata is like our everyday life of just having iskafia and making unity with Hashem, even though we experience ourselves as totally separate. Here we're talking about a miracle which is above nature entirely, so from coming from the Yechida and everything else, but we're calling it Yehuda Tata for this reason, that it recognizes the existence of the other and is negating it. And he says this is similar to the Mesiras Nefesh of Chanukah. Right? The notion that the Yechida was encloaked in the revealed powers, similar to the idea that of Yehuda Tata, that there's a notion of opposition that's being subjugated. Afterwards, the light gets drawn down in a higher way. So that first level nace was brought into nature. But then there was the next level nace. And what was the second miracle? They found the jar of oil sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol. And the idea is that this doesn't give room for opposition. The fact that you're underground, hidden away, sealed from the opposition, from the negative forces. So it's all very symbolic, right? The idea is that it's not just, what was the miracle? They found a jar, yes, but the notion that this jar was beyond the touch, beyond the reach of the Giburim and the Rabim, like all these many klippas, which represents nature, the natural world, the feeling of self, it didn't really have any ability to cloak, as it were, this level of godliness. When the idea of the jar is sealed, It represents the idea that they're not able to touch the oil in it in order to contaminate it. So the worldliness, the powers, the kochas agiloyim, the notion of the 10 spheres, that which is world and separateness, is basically unable to affect this level of the Yechida, right? Unlike the first one where the Yechida comes down and experiences the opponent, has to fight with the opponent, is cloaked in nature. Here, it's like sort of preserved and hiding from nature. Umakol shekain ha'inyan techasum b'chosma shel kohen gadol b'panimius ha'inyanim. How much more so when you picture the inner dimension of what it means to be sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol. It represents a level of light where external forces cannot touch it at all. It's impervious to darkness, right? The first one was definitely not impervious to darkness. It's just that it had the power to defeat the darkness. Here, the darkness cannot touch it at all. Nonetheless, even this miracle, which is impervious to darkness, right? It was still encloaked in nature in some way. The fact that they had to find it, right? That's not a miracle that goes completely beyond the rules of nature, right? In other words, someone could explain that naturally. Oh, they left it there, they didn't find it. The fact of the matter is, it was an ace which was beyond nature, just like the winning of the war was in fact an ace which was beyond nature. But it came down and cloaked itself into something which could be explained theoretically, naturally. And this is what it says in the Maimer, Now, how did the Frierdiker Rebbe categorize this miracle before? He said the miracle of the finding of the oil was called the higher unity, Yichud Ilah, right? Or the lower state of Hashem. If you recall, we went into this at great length, right? That the higher unity is associated with the name Havaya overtaking, so to speak, the nature of Elokim, but it's only the lower name of the Havaya which is relevant to the Ishtalshalus. Now, why is that? Because when it comes to the Shem Havaya, there is no opponent really. Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei means past, present, future all at once. It's a state which is above nature. When it comes to the name of Havaya, which is the lower name of Havaya, it's still in the name. It means it's the source of bringing things into existence. So Havaya basically sits on two sides of the fence. On one hand, Havaya is impervious to darkness because it's in a state which precedes enclosure, and that's why it was sealed by the Kohen Gadol's seal, hidden away, because that level of divinity you can't wrap yourself around it and hide it from being God. It's impervious to darkness, as we said. On the other hand, it's the source of existence, because Havaya comes from the word mehave, right? Lihios, mishave, to bring things into being. The whole idea is, Havaya means to be, right? So it's the being which creates the nature. So it's definitely associated with creation on its lower level. That's not its full-time job. The real name of Havaya is the higher level of Havaya, which is just like the pure being of God. But it has a night job, right? Which is that it also serves to be the energy which is the underlying force of creation. So it's the source of creation. So again, it's untouchable by creation, but it's not completely unaware or disconnected from creation, because ultimately it's the source of the enlivening power that gives energy to creation. And that's what we're saying, that it's kind of like this Yehuda Ilah situation. It's still cloaked in nature to some degree, because it has even though it's Havaya, it has association with the powers, the revealed powers. Yeah. So,
if the lower unity of the Shem Havaya is Yehuda Tata.
No.
Wait, the lower unity is not really associated with the Shem Havaya. We said it's associated more with his name Elokim.
Okay. So low. Okay, that's what I got confused. Low unity is Yehuda Tata, which is Elokus, which is Arach Ampin, and then the lower aspect of the name Havaya is high unity.
Yes. Right.
So the Yehuda Ilah is high unity, which is like
the lower Hashem.
Is Atik Yomen. But when we talk about Atigyom in consideration of the Seder Ishtalshalos, I often use a description of Hashem in relation to the expression of Hashem, without taking into consideration of creation, because Arach Anpin is Hashem in relation to the expression of creation, of the potential for creation. So you're saying that Yehuda Ilah can even have some level of connection to the potential of creation.
Yeah, because it's the source of it, right? It's not actually like crawling into its boundary, but he's saying the word Havaya means to make be, to make something be, right? So you're not, in other words, like imagine that in this world, you have like energy and form, right? Energy and matter. So if you speed, according to the theory, if you speed something up to the speed of light, it will cease to have form and, right? It'll just become like pure energy. So what everything is essentially in this world is just slowed down energy, which like sort of takes shape because of it's been trapped into form. So the energy which is enlivening this form, it can never really be like owned by the form, because it's always at a state where it's sort of like standing aloof from it and like the generator of it all.
At its essence, it is energy.
However, you can take it and you can be confused by it. Yes, it's at its essence, it's energy. But you can, at lower levels of perception, it looks like it's being grabbed down and turned into something else. But it's kind of like an illusion, right? So this is what we're saying. Like at the lowest levels, godliness actually becomes a thing, right? Now the reality is it's God. So it will. If those things want to try and fight with it, it's always going to win, right? Because it only looks like it's been trapped by the many and the strong, right? But ultimately, those many and the strong are just actually it, right? In like a foreign klippa body, and therefore, if you're going to really take up with it and try and overcome it, the godliness will defeat you every time. It's like, who do you think you are? I'm making you, and you're gonna go against me, right? But at least it cloaks itself so deeply into the world that the world can like have that relationship with it. There's another level of it where it doesn't allow itself to actually become cloaked into the world. But all those potential forms of the world are sort of like in there, able to come out of it and to create the world. That's the lower level of Havaya. It's responsible for making everything, but it's not the thing that gets made. That's the Shem Elokim.
So it's like holding blueprints of everything.
Yes,
like it's holding blueprints.
That's right. It's like holding blueprints of everything. So on one hand, the blueprints are not. They're safe from the war. They're not in the building. They're not in like the world of action where something can actually go against them. So they're sealed in the jar of the Kohen Gadol, with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, like impervious to the whole battle of like craziness that you can like take something with this blueprint and make something that looks like it opposes God. They're not in that game. You can't oppose the blueprint. But to say that the blueprint has nothing to do with reality is also not true. It's the blueprint for reality. Right? And so therefore it has some association with nature, and that's why they had to find the jar. Because there was still some connection with worldliness in that miracle, in that level of Yechida as it came down on the 25th. Yeah. Right? Which is called Yehuda Ilah for a very good reason. It's the higher unity. It unifies the world from a perspective where the world is not fighting with the world. It just like sort of like draws the world to order, saying like, hello, you remember me? I'm making you all the time. You have no existence without me. So it unifies the world in a way where it just basically negates it. And that's again called the lower Havaya. And that's why it still has association with the world. And that's why the miracle was still cloaked in some level of nature. Not like a mamash, a battle, right? Where the nature is like strong and mighty. But still, there was some association with nature. They had to find the pach. Right? It all kind of works out pretty nicely here. And then afterwards, they drew down from the light, which is even higher, where they lit for 8 days. And this was a miracle that was in no way encloaked in nature. You can't take a jar of oil worth 1 day of oil and light it for 8 days. According to nature, that was an opening of the revelation of Havaya de La'ela as it is in its place above the Seder Ishtalshalos. In other words, we something was brought into this world which was completely not only beyond the world, the Shem Elohim, it was even beyond the level of God which enlivens the world. It was like God by himself, right? But God by himself was triggered to come out in this world and have like a presence here all of a sudden, so it defied everything to do with nature, right? For 8 days. And why 8 days? Because it's a level 8 type situation.
And that's like Panemius Arctic.
Right.
That's Radla. That's like,
Yeah, I mean, he's not putting those definitions on, but they work.
yeah.
Okay. Yesh lahosif. So actually, it's all coming together pretty nicely here. You guys following along? Yaakov, you in the game? Okay. All right. So yesh lahosif, we want to add this that the miracles of winning the war and finding the oil, they also come from the higher level of Havaya that's above the Ishtalshlus. Just what that they were encloaked in the levels of Ishtalshlus, whether it be Yehuda Tata or Yehuda Ilah, right? So this whole thing that we've been saying, that they really come from the third level, but they got cloaked into the lower two levels. The reason is because they were a preparation for the big miracle of, which is today's miracle, by the way. Today's the 26th. We have to realize that we're living with the times here, right? The big miracle is the second day of Chanukah, actually, and the 25th and the 24th. The reason why they were cloaked in nature is because they were a lead-in. You can't just rock in to the 8th level without leading up to it, right? Which is to get to a miracle which is entirely not cloaked in nature. That these miracles in and of themselves are primarily lower level miracles. In other words, when you look at them, even though we're telling you now that what they really were higher level miracles, just encloaked, if you would look at them, you would see a miracle encloaked in nature, which means it's not like an open miracle which defies nature. Now, since the miracle of winning the war was actually the cause, we're now going to start getting to some of our answers from the beginning. It was the cause, the underlying cause of finding the jar.
Yes.
Right? As we said in the beginning of the Maimer, which is one of the reasons why we were really pushing that it should be part of the holiday, because if they didn't win the war, they couldn't have found the jar, which is the 25th. So he says, after it became, the miracle happened in that jar that they found, that it lit for 8 days. So once they basically, since this winning of the war was the reason that they found the jar, which then ultimately was the reason that it wound up having what to light for 8 days, is that now once the 26th miracle happened of today, right? It then basically saying retroactively went back and made it that those other two were holding on the same level. Right? So once they revealed the level 8 on the third miracle, then it can be drawn down also into the miracles of the Pach Hashem and the war.
So dealing with the rabbim and nature and overcoming it, the aspect of the separation through Elohim, through that level of creation, allows for a portal of a higher level interacting with the lower level of Shem Havaya, which then allows you to interact with the highest level of Shem Havaya, and then that retroactively elevates Elohim.
Yes, that's what he's saying right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Strange.
It is. Because it was the cause, in other words, because you wouldn't have gotten to the top without the bottom, when you get to the top, it basically unlocks a reality of the bottom that I guess was always there, but was not yet revealed.
Okay.
So it's almost like what jumped into my mind right now is sort of like when you look at the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidus, let's say, versus the Alter Rebbe, because we're just coming off Yud Kislev, it's kind of fresh in the mind. We didn't know what the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidus actually was until the Alter Rebbe came along, right? So if you didn't have the Baal Shem Tov, you never would have had the Alter Rebbe.
Yeah.
But once you have the Alter Rebbe, you now know something about the Baal Shem Tov you never knew before. It's like, because everything that the Alter Rebbe said was, in fact, sitting inside the Baal Shem Tov, it just, you didn't see it, right? And so, because the Baal Shem Tov caused the Chabad Hasidus to come out, it actually caused the Baal Shem Tov to be a Chabadnik, you know what I'm saying? Like retroactively.
Yeah.
Because it was the source of everything that came out later, even though you couldn't see it in the source, right? And you can say the same thing about like Kol Torah Kula, but basically like Moshe's Torah was the source of Mishnah, Gemara, Chassidus, Halacha, Nigla, but you didn't know that until like later it came out. Once all that came out, it kind of gives a big boost to the original, realizing that it has all that inside of there, right? Okay, let's see how that plays out. V'zeu shekavu haschalas mechanukah b'chaf he b'kislev. All right, so we still have some answering to do, because why did they set up the first day would be the 25th of Kislev? Shaboya Nes Haneros, where the miracle of the lights happened, whereas now the 24th. If we're saying that goes back to the original, the war was the cause of it all, so maybe that should have been the beginning of the holiday, right? Why did we sort of stop short of that and we made the beginning of the holiday only on the 25th? Which is specifically the miracle of the lights, not the miracle of the war. And the reason is because the fullness of the miracle of the winning of the war on the 24th, which is Yichud Tata, Hu shemegalim bo al yidei nes hashemen, shegam hu hanes nitzachon milchama shor shehu l'mayla mishtalshlus. That's a mouthful we have to get in our mouths here. Right? He says, is that like this? Why did they make the holiday on the 25th and not the 24th? Because the fullness, the wholeness of the miracle of the war on the 24th, which is Yichud Tata, is Shemigalim bo al yidei nes hashemen, is that you reveal in it through the miracle of the oil that also the miracle of the war, its source is from above the Seder Ishtalshlus. One more time. Basically what he's saying here is that what is like sort of the completion of the winning of the war is the realization that it leads to the jar of oil, right? Which shows retroactively that the war itself was from above the Seder Ishtalshlus. If it would have just been the war, you would have thought that was basically something natural, right? It's so encloaked in nature because there's almost like opponents to godliness at that level. You're doing a Yichud Tata. There's like, you're not dealing with anything totally supernatural. On the contrary, there's like almost a war going on, right? So the whole idea is that you can't celebrate that in and of itself. You can only celebrate that when you realize that it leads to a miracle which is above nature, which is finding the oil, the 25th. Then that shows you retroactively that the war you were fighting before was not simply a matter of mere Yehuda Tata. It was actually something above nature, which was just encloaked in a lower level. So you can't celebrate it yet in and of itself, right? You can only celebrate it when it gets to its completion and when it was realized what it actually was, which is the 25th. Yeah.
This reminds me of what we were first talking about in the very first, like, Mima you taught when I came here in Elul.
Okay.
And when you're talking about the Mashpia-Makabel relationship, and you're talking about the process of thoughts in our mind, because thoughts, they're constructed with the letters, but the letters that are in our mind come from a higher source, which is the source of all the letters. But the higher source is its own like revelation of itself. Like you think the letter Aleph, or you think the word Adam, or you think when you think that in your mind, those letters are made up of the letters of the higher source. But it's only until you think of those letters that it goes retroactively back into the source and pulls those letters down in order to reveal it. It's like that relationship and becoming free. Because I've literally got the same directional arrows in my notes, where it goes from the mashpia, the intermediary, to the makabel, and then it goes back from the makabel to mashpia. And this is the exact same process is happening again, except with the high processes of the name Shem Havaya and Elohim, with the high levels and low levels. Like the same process is happening.
I'm sort of getting what you're saying there.
Yeah.
It's I need some directional arrows.
I'll show you.
No, but
After.
yeah, no, it's deep stuff what you're saying. All right, let me just try and say this one sentence again to make sure we're getting it right. So this that they fixed the holiday on the 25th, right, which was the miracle of the lights, which again, the miracle of the lights, either the 25th or the 26th, but even the 25th is something above nature. It was connected a little bit with nature, but it was the idea is that it was not a war, impervious to the opponent, because the completion of the war miracle on the 24th, which is merely Yehuda Tata, how do you complete the Yehuda Tata? Is that you reveal that through it, the Yehudi Ilah. In other words, that when the lower process reaches its completion and shows you that it led to the finding of the oil, which was supernatural, then that goes back and shows you that the origin of this process was also supernatural. If it led to a miracle which was above nature, it means that even though you were still fighting through the nature to get there, when the result of it was that, oh, this is above nature, we just did something that was totally above nature, so then even the beginning of that process must have been above nature, right? So there's no point in celebrating, so to speak, the beginning of the process in that sense, because you don't even know the beginning of the process is supernatural until you get to the end of the process. Right? So celebrating the 25th is basically a celebration of the 24th, but it puts it into proper context because you're not celebrating a regular war. When you start the celebration of the 25th, you're showing that the 24th was in fact the beginning of a supernatural process which couldn't be seen until the 25th. Does that make sense? I think it does. So now he says, wait a second. There's actually a greater quality in the lower unity than there is in the higher unity, which I was mentioning before about the difference between davening and learning Chassidus, right? Like this, and what he said, like, you know, when the Yechida is actually going into the place of the enemy, as opposed to just being like in its brilliant standalone, there's actually an advantage for the lower unity over the higher unity. So maybe we should specifically celebrate the lower unity. Again, what's the advantage of the lower unity over the higher unity?
You can uproot the opposition.
Right, you're not going over its head.
Yeah.
Right? And by the way, the fact that there's an advantage in the lower unity over the higher unity is actually demonstrated here, because the fact is that the winning of the war led to the finding of the jar. So just like in a historical pattern, you can see that there is something that the cause and the effect, right? The cause is always higher than the effect because the cause brings about the effect. So even we're celebrating the effect. We're saying, look, the 25th, there was a miracle here, and therefore we're not going to celebrate the mere cause because we only know that cause is miraculous when we get to the effect. But on the other hand, hold on a second. The cause is always greater than the effect. You can't have an effect without a cause. So you should stop to celebrate the effect. The cause. You with me on that? Mm-hmm. Because the winning of the war led to the finding of the oil. Nevertheless, sorry, it doesn't work like that in this case. Because you only really realize what the utility of a lower level unity is when it reaches the higher level unity, as he explains in the Mimer. And in simple words, in other words, you want to, if you're making a lower level unity, it's like you're bending your will all the time to Hashem's will. The world is still in a state which is basically lying about its truth, right? Yes, you're being a good boy. You'll get a pat on the back, but like you're still demonstrating that you are ultimately in opposition with Hashem. The fact you have to constantly go against your own interests to serve God, it's mighty, right? It's an awesome, powerful thing to bend your will so stubbornly all the time. But until you get to a point where you actually turn your will into the divine will and remove the feeling of separateness, it's really just us. It's you haven't reached the what it means real unity. It's a lower unity has certain qualities which are advantageous in terms of like its bittul and the hard work, and then it's a cause for the higher unity. But if you would leave the world in a state of lower unity, Hashem's will would not be done. It would be a continuous state of opposition, as though there's something besides Hashem. So until your sort of practice leads to perfection, that you actually change yourself and you are now aligned with God's will, there's nothing to totally celebrate about the lower unity. In other words, the cause really has to create its effect in order to be considered to be really worthy and worthwhile. Even though it has like a little advantage in there, it's not worthy of celebration until it reaches the higher unity. We're sort of out of time here. We're kind of a bad place to be stopping, but worse things have happened. All right, we'll see you guys next time.